Hello, this is DM Rob G, and welcome to my Freya's Follower channel. This channel is one I plan to speak about my spiritual beliefs. I do this for two reasons. One, it is a form of worship where I tend to speak about how I feel about the gods. Yes, cat. As you can see, Sekhmet here approves. I would like this channel to both inspire and teach others, as well as learn others' viewpoints. Now, I do come from a really westernized viewpoint. However, I am beginning to learn about the different languages and cultures. Yes. Yes, I see you. Hi. I acknowledge them. I appreciate it, cat. Now, I have also been studying a bit about the archaeological aspects of the gods themselves and how they're worshipped in, with this particular example, Greece. But it is actually quite complex, so I only have the most basic of information. Now, I do hope to cover some evolution in these videos and talking about how the archaeology and research I've done has influenced my beliefs. Now, this video is going to have a lot of what is known as UPG, or unverified personal gnosis, which basically means my own interpretation and my own beliefs. While I think that is true for all of us, I feel that it's good to remind others that I am not going to try and be the end-all be-all of any god. Now, I'm also sorry about the lighting. I am actually moving soon, and I hope to set up a proper studio. But for now, everything's kind of a bit of a mess, as you can see. I mean, hell, I have a vacuum right there. Floor's dirty, for goodness sakes. But the subject of this video is the Goddess Persephone. The Goddess Persephone is one of the most well-known of the Greek gods, but it's also the most misunderstood. Well, kind of. Truth is, her myth is one of the most reinterpreted and reimagined myths of the ancient world. As far as I'm aware, the Persephone loves Hades myths are at least the modern interpretation of those, are a modern retelling of the ancient myths, designed to change the power dynamics as well as the basic lesson of the story. For example, in the original Homeric myths, Persephone is kicking and screaming for help as she is kept in Hades' bedchamber. It is also in these Homeric myths where Hades himself tricks or forces Persephone to take the pomegranate seeds. However, there are also other ancient myths that change this power dynamic a little bit, and I can elaborate on that later. But there is a more modern interpretation that Persephone walked in her own world of her own free will, which originated in 1978 when Charlene Spretnak wrote The Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, a collection of pre-Hellenic mythology, a book intended to remove the rather offensive and horrific elements of sexual assault in the Greek pantheon. Now, again, I can get into all that later, after I've basically covered the Homeric myth itself. You might notice I miss a few details here and there, but that is because when it really comes down to it, these details change on society as well as the era the myth is told in, and what the specific storyteller wants to emphasize. So if I were to stop and explain every detail of the story itself, my video would absolutely drag to a halt in this section. So it's kind of bland, but here we go. A young girl known as Kore, meaning maiden, is playing in a field with her nymph friends, under the watchful eye of her mother Demeter. Cat hair. She searches, eventually finds that her daughter was taken into the underworld, and is now in Hades' realm. Demeter tries to get her daughter to return. In most interpretations, Zeus actually arranged for Hades to kidnap Persephone. Now, this next part isn't always here in every version of them. Demeter goes ahead and basically disguises herself as a castle servant and takes care of King Ulysses' son, Demophon. Demeter uses her powers to try to burn away all of Demophon's mortal essence. However, one day she is caught dipping Demophon into what is basically a large campfire. by one of the other castle servants, and in a rage reveals herself to be the goddess Demeter. Demeter then retreats to her temple, where she enters into what is basically a full sulk mode. Depression in such a situation is normal, but it is really problematic when the goddess in question is responsible to get the plants growing. Plants don't grow when there's mass starvation, and the gods have no worshippers. So Zeus allows Persephone to return from the land of the dead. However, it turns out that Persephone has consumed several pomegranate seeds, which bind her to the land of the dead. As a result, she is forced to remain in the land of the dead for between 3 and 6 months out of the year, depending on the myth. So, the seasons are a result of Persephone heading to the underworld, Demeter getting depressed, and then growing happy again when Persephone returns. Now, do you see what I mean when I said to cover the basics? Most of what we think as Persephone's myth is actually about Demeter. In addition, much of what Persephone went through is actually determined by where you get the story from. In the Orphic myths, or the myths told directly by Orpheus, Persephone is actually in quite a horrific experience. She is written as pleading and begging Hades for her mother. On the other hand, more modern tellings have a more peaceful, even a joyous time in the underworld. While we both have Persephone rising status to the queen of the underworld, the basic difference is basically how society viewed women and whether or not they have basic rights. In Athenian Greece, for example, women were kind of expected to stay in all day, raised by their mothers, and talk to no one. In Athenian culture, the fact that Zeus would arrange a marriage without the knowledge of either Persephone or Demeter was basically business as usual and occurred on a daily basis. The fact that Kore would be crying inside of Hades' bedchamber, while the Lord of the Underworld wants her to stay, even plotting a method to keep her around when her mother finally manages to free her, is basically daily life for Athenian women. Now keep in mind, in the Orphic myth, Hades either tricks Persephone into eating the pomegranate seeds or forces her to eat the pomegranate seeds. Now, the story itself, from my understanding, is basically a metaphor for marriage in Athens. There is also a death metaphor here, and I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. There's even acknowledgement that the myth itself was what happened to her is actually unjust. Looking at the myth through this lens, it's as if the myth of Persephone is something akin to a coping mechanism, telling mothers, yes, your daughter misses you. You'll never see her again. The husband has rightfully married her off, but look, Demeter was able to earn visitation right. Now, get back to the kitchen, serve your husband, hope you might see her again, and listen to some stories about how assault is a fact of everyday life. You are all whores seduced by animals. Men are completely awesome. Even a goddess can escape the kidnapping, the assault, and forced marriage with Demeter's visitation rights only earned through the deaths of thousands. And she literally held the world hostage. Also remember that this story was used at the festival of Demeter herself. Viewed in that context, it seems to be a sort of acknowledgement of how women were going through in Athenian culture. It's actually been a bit since I recorded that first section, and I lost my shirt and got a haircut, and I moved a bit, as you can see by the background, so I'm going to continue on. But there are other myths that build upon this one. All of them, except for this first one, have a version where Hades is the protagonist. And for the most part, I'm actually going to concentrate on the version of the myth that has Persephone as the protagonist, because obviously. Now, the Greek geographer and historian Strabo gives us this following myth. Mnemosyne was a nymph of the river Cocytus, or the river of the wailing dead in the underworld. Hades once took Mnemosyne as a mistress. Now, this is normal in Greek society. It is expected that men be men and basically take on mistresses. And you can even see this with Zeus, with Hera, when he cheats on Hera all the time in his myths. That is normal and expected in Greek society. However, according to Strabo, Persephone took exception to this, especially when Mnemosyne declared herself better than Persephone. At that point, Persephone basically trampled Mnemosyne under her foot and transformed her into a plant. The very plant we know as mint. By the way, on that note, mint to Persephone, unless you do it in unless you disrespect the mint. Like tearing the mint up, for example. Trampling it under your foot. That sort of thing. Now, to further the story of Persephone in Hades, Apollodorus writes in his work Bibliotheca that Theseus and Persephone agree to enter the underworld, having the intentions to court and marry Persephone. So, given that this is the underworld, and keep in mind, according to Greek tradition, people in the underworld can hear when you think about them, Hades welcomes them both in the underworld. Theseus and Persephone accept, under the distinct impression that Hades is one of those normal Greek people who is willing to sell his wife. However, the minute they sit down in what is known as the Throne of Lethe, or, as we know it, the Throne of Forgetfulness, at which point they are wrapped in the chair by serpents, sealed tight for all eternity, and forgetting the entirety of the very being, knowing only they were someone, but they forget who. This story itself is referenced in the myth of Hercules, where Hercules enters the underworld and attempts to free them. At the minute he touches those serpents, the entire underworld is rocked by a massive earthquake, signaling Hades how rather irritated Hades is at the prospect of those two being freed in any way, shape, or form. Hades and Persephone are also written of in the book Metamorphoses by the Greek mythographer Antonius Liberals. I'm not kidding, it is actually spelled liberals, where they are written to have inflicted the city of Thebes with a deadly plague as punishment for the ruler King Kron's refusal to allow the burial of the 7 warriors of the army of 7 against Thebes. When Gracanes sacrificed themselves to appease the gods, they were transformed into a pair of comets. There is even this throwaway line when Odysseus travels into the underworld in his myth, where he's plagued by ghosts. His only response to this plague of ghosts is, "Oh fuck, Persephone's at it again," which hinting that Persephone's kind of famous for random ghost plays in the underworld. Since those stories themselves feature Persephone's wrath, it is only fair to look at blessings in Persephone's favor. And you'll have to forgive me, but my prep time on this was rather limited, so I'm going on very limited prep time at this moment, so if it looks like I'm reading, I probably am. But when Orpheus goes to bring back his wife from the dead, it is Persephone who allows this in the work Diodorus Siculus Library of History number 4. Now remember, taking someone from the dead is a very big deal in Greek mythology. Please see Persephone's myth about how she wasn't allowed to come back except under rule of Zeus, and even then that's only because Demeter threatened all of existence. However, Orpheus managed to convince the goddess Persephone to allow his wife to return to the land of the living by making a song so sad the entire underworld wept. Persephone herself gave a stipulation. She can only return to the land of the living only if Odysseus makes the trip without looking back. Orpheus makes this trip. However, a few feet from the exit, Orpheus turns back to see if his wife was indeed following him, because the aspect of making this trip to and from and playing the song was so absolutely stressful that he needed to make sure that she was there. Hi! At which point, Orpheus' wife was yanked back to the land of the dead. Persephone did warn him, so it really was kind of his fault. I honestly think there's an element of Persephone totally knew this would happen, therefore she really didn't violate natural order. But at the same time, I get the sense that that had Orpheus not looked back and performed this Herculean feat himself, she would have absolutely allowed this break of natural order to take place. But since Persephone knew that Orpheus was mortal, there really was no risk of breaking this natural order. From what I could tell, after several thousand years and without a degree in history, Demeter's myth was an acknowledgement of the trials that women would face, while in every other addition to Persephone's story was a further coping mechanism for the one goddess who actually had power and respect in Greek culture. Now, remember that Death was the basically big thing you do not talk about. You could talk about Zeus every day. Mentioning Hades by name is to catch Hades' attention. Euphemisms were used to address both Hades and Persephone, such as he with the greatest army, he who rules the land, he who rules the afterlife, or something along those lines. Not addressing him by name is a form of self-protection. Now, the coping mechanism of Persephone's auxiliary myths wasn't really needed anymore, so these auxiliary myths were somewhat forgotten in popular culture. In fact, I would also wager that these auxiliary myths weren't really welcome in a heavily Judeo-Christian society, where women couldn't really be queens or even be equal parts of society. So as a result, many of these auxiliary myths were forgotten by all but the most serious scholars. And I have screwed up my deck. All but the most serious scholars. In more modern times, the marriage metaphor also seems to have fallen by the wayside, especially considering massive gains in equality women have made since the civil women's rights movement of the 1920s, and later on into the 1970s. The only part of Persephone's myth taught in schools for the aforementioned reasons, was Demeter's portion of the myths. Now, I'm not sure it's always been taught in its proper context. It would be more akin to saying, hey, this is a Cherokee myth, or hey, the following story was invented by the Navajo, or hey, the following is from the Torah. There is no real. I'm mentioning the story of the myth itself, but not its cultural aspects. By the time Charlene Spretnak had changed Persephone's story in 1978, Roe v. Wade had ruled the Supreme Court for 5 years. The Equal Pay Act passed in 1973, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was in 1974 and allowed women their own credit lines. In essence, there was no need for Demeter as a coping story. So essentially, she made this myth so they wouldn't be exposed to the assault and degradation of female characters present in other myths. Other goddesses we know of, such as the myths of Ereshkigal, Lilith, and Ishtar, weren't widely known by the popular public. So while Charlene Spretnak did make these changes, she actually made the changes to the myth in a way that was appropriate for her society at the time, changing every aspect of Kore's character and story, quite accidentally finding the power of Persephone's myth. Persephone being a symbolic power that comes from helping women in a specific time frame in her myth, serving as a powerful goddess that can't really be touched in male human society. Spretnak changing of the myth completely fits in with Persephone's, sort of the flavor of Persephone's power, but not necessarily the archaeological truth. What Persephone changed into was a powerful woman goddess that society needed at the time, even if it was kind of based on an archaeological lie. I'm finding that now a lot of people are acknowledging the archaeological truth of the original Greek myths, while when I was younger and in college, more people acknowledged the truth of Spretnak's version. In fact, it was to the point where Spretnak's version was basically all I heard in popular culture. There were powerful goddesses, but they were powerful goddesses in basically the same social construct that Spretnak made. We didn't realize how powerful they were in their own myths. In fact, many of the modern interpretations of Persephone's myths have a interpretation of Persephone enters the underworld to get away from a overbearing helicopter mother, something that would probably be far more relatable the time of ancient Athenian Greece. Now, speaking of differences between the ancient and modern myths, there are differing versions. Actually, have many differences between one of the most heavily debated offerings among modern Persephone followers. I call this the Great Pomegranate Divide. Essentially, there is a debate on whether or not pomegranates belong on Persephone's altar, and it is one of the most heavily debated aspects of modern-day reconstructionists. While pomegranates are indeed part of Persephone, how people feel about it varies whether or not they are more traditionalist or not. Basically, the two arguments are as follows. One, people who say that pomegranates do not belong on Persephone's altar see pomegranates usually adhere more to the ancient Greek myth version, whereas people who say that pomegranates do belong on Persephone's altar are more likely to follow more modern interpretations of the myth, or see her eating a pomegranate as the beginning of her godhood, turning from Kore the maiden to Persephone the goddess. The best way I can explain it is that it's basically about the question of power. In the ancient Greek version, Hades either forced or tricked Persephone to eat the pomegranate seeds, which took away her power of choice. In more modern myths, Persephone ate the pomegranate seeds to gain godhood herself. Now, truthfully, what you prefer is kind of a personal choice. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. It's really what you prefer. Surely, if Persephone's life was in the Greek underworld the result of a horrific kidnapping, pomegranates would be bad because that would be the start of her horror. But if it was as the start of a powerful godhood, pomegranates would probably be a positive thing. Now, I use pomegranates in my practice, and I feel that Persephone loves them. My personal interpretation of the entire myth is that basically combines these two beliefs, where her journey on the world is more of a death metaphor rather than a women are powerless metaphor that the ancient Greeks would have understood. Honestly, it's because the politics of today are different from the gender politics of ancient Greece. For me, it's not a story about a mother losing her child at a very young age and heads through the grieving process, taking care of Demophos, even taking the young infant, burning away his mortality out of him, seeming to serve as a replacement for her daughter trapped in the underworld. Then once this process failed, at the untimely entrance of another maid, Demeter goes into a depression, resulting in the untimely deaths of thousands, as well as a complete reversal of natural law. At the same time, no matter how Demeter feels, no matter how much it hurts to the point where she can't get out of bed to give plants her energy, death is a mutable part of life. It affects us all, rips away those we love and those who love us, and whether by accident or on purpose, these threads of death basically bind Persephone to the underworld. But this metaphor for me becomes even deeper as pomegranates, going back to ancient Greece, are a symbol of rebirth, life, and fertility. And if I understand it, represent male genitalia. Meaning what binds Persephone to the underworld is this exact same thing that gives us life. So, why did Persephone stay in the underworld? Well, from my understanding, the tree itself that she ate from is part of the underworld. It had underworld energies in it. When she ate the pomegranate from that particular tree, she took those energies and made them a part of herself. So when Persephone ate the fruit, she took all those energies and made them part of her soul. In essence, her body and soul became part of the underworld, became intertwined with the energies of the underworld. In the same way that someone would become a part of the fairy realm in British myth, or in Celtic myth. Basically, it's up to each person to decide whether this was a willing or unwilling action. For me, I like the view that all of what Demeter went through was natural for someone who had lost a child to death. When Persephone saw what was happening to her mother, she wanted to help, so she was the one who would bind herself to the underworld willingly and come out of the underworld 6 months out of the year and retreat for 6 months out of the year. Which comes to another concept. The concept of Kore and Persephone as two different deities. Now this was recently introduced to me, but there's a concept that Kore exists as an actual semi-separate entity from Persephone. Now, I have mostly interacted with Persephone myself, but to me, Persephone feels more dark than Kore, I guess. When I interact with Kore, I can see that for me, she is actually absolutely part of dreaded Queen Persephone, who rules on the world with full knowledge that all mortals will enter her domain. There is sort of this darkness as Kore dances with her nymph friends, becoming part of the goddess of spring. But at the same time, when I interact with Persephone, I can see part of Kore. There is, no matter how dark, dreary, threatening Persephone can be, full of death energy Persephone can be, there is still part of that fun-loving Kore spirit. Now, like whenever I enter meditation and talk to Persephone about something I'm really proud of, I can feel that childlike joy from Persephone herself. There's always a bit of Kore in Persephone, as there is a bit of Kore in Persephone. To me, that might be a reminder of how life is short, so we need to enjoy as much as we can. And I know some of you might have a hard time talking about me, but think about it like this. Earth is divided into the northern and southern hemisphere. When spring is in the northern hemisphere, it is winter in the southern hemisphere. But both parts, while they have their unique climates and unique energies, the other side is having the exact opposite. Kore and Persephone are both ever present and different, while still part of the same whole as these two hemispheres. They are absolutely these two hemispheres are part of the same planet, despite one half being warmer and having a different climate than the other half. They are still opposites, but same part of the entire ecosystem. Persephone seems to be the more serious of the pair as far as I can tell, but that could just be what I need to hear from Persephone at that time. Kore, as far as I can tell, seems to be more outgoing, but at the same time, well, this is sort of the statue I have of Persephone. You can see the her plant aspects. You can see her death aspects. This is what I see when I think of Persephone. Yes, there are flowers in the hair, long flowing hair along the back, pomegranate in one hand, skulls combined with wheat, as symbols of both her plant aspects and her death aspects. Now, when I think of Kore, I think of this statue, which I unfortunately do not have right now. But notice how, even though this statue is naked and seems to be more for the male gaze, this is what I see for people who are basically from someone who is having fun dancing with nymphs. She might be topless, but then again, that is what I expect with someone who dances with nymphs. So, when it comes to offerings, I absolutely give floral scented items to Persephone, as well as pomegranate seeds. I also give these floral scented items to Kore, should I ever need to invoke Kore in my practice. But then again, I also work with Persephone far more than I work with Kore. Now, on a special note, roses I tend to keep just for Aphrodite. But I think Persephone would love them as well. And honestly, I think Persephone herself, Persephone and Kore both love more wildflowers like lilies and daisy. Now that we've covered Kore, it's actually time to move on to something I've hinted on. And that is where I talk about my personal experiences. Hopefully I've given a framework to understand where I'm coming from in these experiences, but for me, my connection with the goddess Persephone started around 8 months ago. I was looking for a new goddess to worship during the light of the full moon, to replace one that I had sort of grown apart from. Now, I feel this pull toward Persephone. I'm not sure what did it. I'm fairly positive Hecate had her hand in it, but I feel this pull toward Persephone, and I decided I'm going to read a bit about her. As I did so, I find that I'm really meshing with Persephone. I find her to be a very welcoming deity. She actively encouraged me to start worshiping her by lighting incense. Within about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, I begin to feel as if someone's saying, "Buy a statue of me, buy a statue of me, buy a statue of me." Kind of like poke me. Imagine some deity poking you in the shoulder saying, "Buy a statue of me, buy a statue of me, buy a statue of me." Which, I mean, fine, it's a deity. Since she was a deity, fine, I wasn't really going to hold her off that long. Now, I managed to find this one on sale, which I've already shown off. Since I have found Persephone, I've also gotten really into this tarot deck. And here you might have been thinking that I was just doing this for funsies. Namely, this Rider White deck I've had since roughly 2002. I've never really gotten into it, but I've actually noticed it's actually kind of spookily accurate now. Like one time a friend asked me if she could get a reading on a piece of exercise equipment she should buy. Which, I mean, so I said I'd do a drawing, sure, it'd be practice. And I honestly I swear to God, I came up with now I'm going to try to do this right, but I came up with the Reversed World, the 5 of Swords, the 9 of Wands reversed. Now, at this point, I'm really upset because quite frankly, these 3 cards aren't really, I don't see them as applicable. These are basically, when you see these 3 together, they're basically mean the following. 1. You feel eclipsed by someone. There are family disputes that you can walk away from and still have your dignity. And 3. You must withstand great opposition. Now, it's not answering anything I've asked. I actually ask for clarification because I don't think it is answering me at all. I get this. I get the Tower. Now, the Tower itself isn't exactly negative. What the Tower means is that soon something will happen to where your entire life, to where you will see what your life is made out of. You will see its component parts as it is revealed to you. Now, I tell her exactly what I've gotten. What she tells me, that such my house's presence in the reading. He's a narcissistic alcoholic and is immensely controlling. You can see this by how he put himself into your reading. Which, I mean, well, fuck. Basically, he was such a controlling influence on her life, it affected my reading. The entire reading appeared as if I was looking through this sort of veil, which would explain everything. If she got the machine, she would probably find out exactly what point her stands on. She does exactly have trouble at home, and she can get out with the dignity intact at this moment. So, at this point, I'm legitimately curious. I did my own reading, and I asked this very deck, what entity helps power you? I came up with the Ace of Swords, the 3 of Swords, and the Queen of Pentacles. All 3 represent Persephone. Basically, Persephone on her throne. The heartbreak Demeter felt when Persephone died or went into the underworld, depending on your creation. And the Ace of Swords, which would represent Hades as he left the underworld and went to gather Persephone. Now, I wondered why, but think about it. Many cultures actually use ancestors or any divination materials to basically divine the truth, divine the future, divine the past. And what I'm thinking happening is it's like in John Wick, where I ask a question and all the ghosts under her rule find the answer and relay it to her via a old-fashioned telephone operation where she relays it to me via my tarot deck. You know what would have been really good? To actually find these cards before I began. Now, speaking of which, there was this other time I took my car in for maintenance. It turns out the transmission needed to be replaced. Fine. It should be done 2 weeks. Alright, one of them was fine. I didn't have money for Uber work for those 2 weeks. But as it turns out, there was one delay after another. One of them was that the transmission got sent to the wrong place, despite them having the right address. The second, despite it being a sort of this new-ish transmission, it had to be rebuilt. So I asked my tarot deck if any deity is responsible, because at this point it's been about a month. No, I'm sorry, it's been about 3 weeks. It's been about 3 weeks. So I asked my tarot deck if any deity is responsible. I drew the I drew the Three of Swords. Now, I know this means Persephone. Now, I also drew the Page of Pentacles, reversed, which means procrastination. I also drew the Three of Cups. Three of Cups means creativity. As far as I could tell, those three cards are basically saying Persephone is responsible for it because of the way I've been procrastinating on my creative stuff, on my YouTube channel, for example. I mean, there are others, but I'm sure there are other interpretations, but to me, that is the one that makes the most sense. So, since I drew Persephone, I basically went into meditation and see if I could get any insight as to the answer. From what I could tell, Persephone basically did so that I would basically be alone without any distractions and have to work on my YouTube channel. I couldn't take my car, go to the park easily. I couldn't do a lot of shopping. I couldn't do a lot of this, a lot of that, where I would normally do instead of doing my YouTube channel. So she put me in a place where I would have to work on myself and my creative stuff. So I buckled down, took some time off work to go ahead and get the foundation for my review series, my DM Rob DG channel, which is turning out to be rather well. I'll go ahead and put it in a link below or at the end of this video if I can figure out how. Now my altar itself is a bit bare, but because I really don't have the space for multiple altars right now. When I move, I'll have some more space and be able to spread out a bit. So I just kind of rotate them out as needed. When it comes to Persephone's altar, I intend to put a statue of Hades there as well. And there's a adorable little plush of Cerberus I found. As for decoration, my intention is to put some gems on the altar as a respect to Hades himself, since part of Hades' purview is the underworld where all the gems are. Now there's a bit more to that, and I should probably go into that in his video, but there's the explanation of Hades being an underworld god, controls minerals, but at the same time the Greeks did not really want to keep calling him for copper, so they referred to him as a different name, but that is still basically him. But I'm likely going to use this National Geographic rock tumbler and these stones I can get for them. While that portion itself is purely Hades, Persephone is still his queen. And I'd probably use some cotton to be ghosts or something, and use some of my basically create a sort of pseudo temple. With that being said, I mostly use incense. Usually some floral scents, jasmine and lavender, for example. And I did find some pomegranate incense. Frankincense and myrrh always have their place, since they were used in funeral rites in many cultures. I also have a love of flowers, similar to a way that flowers would be used in a funeral to honor the dead. I also intend to have a balcony of pots of several living flowers, especially if Kore is involved. And even then, symbols of grain, for example. And I also intend to use these. These sugar skulls, for example, are something that I tend to decorate. Now, what I intend to do is actually these... God damn it. I intend to use these markers. See, what you do is you make it in marker. So when you put it in a window, it has a stained glass effect. But that is actually all I have for now for Persephone. Please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I intend to do some readings and give some advice on my tarot deck. On several of my tarot decks, actually. And the goddesses who power them. And I am actually kind of sorry for the quality of this video. I am indeed moving, and you can see I have boxes instead of the vacuum. I hope you don't mind me bringing politics into my channel. But I did lose the other shirt. Or I didn't lose it. I think it's in the dirty clothes bin. But everyone, please have fun and enjoy. Don't forget to check out my DM Rob G channel. But for now, everyone, please have fun and enjoy.